All right, my English teacher friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you with a writing workshop for Is Harry Potter Evil by Judy Blume. And I'm going to perform a rhetorical analysis writing workshop for this. And here's what I mean by that. I'm going to start with an absolutely blank canvas, a la Bob Ross. And I'm going to paint for you and your students a variety of introductory paragraphs using my declarative thesis heuristic. From there, I'm going to move into the body paragraphs in which I use the syllogistic method heuristic, and I'll show you a couple of body paragraphs for that. And then some of our conclusion stems that we often use for rhetorical analysis. So that's what we're going to do for the next half hour or so. And at the end, we will have a complete rhetorical analysis. And just as a little aside, these are the heuristics that my students use for the AP language exam. But I also teach on-level juniors. And we do a fair amount of rhetorical analysis in the New York State curriculum. So I'm in the Rochester, New York area. And this is what we do on a daily basis in Mr. Kuhn's class. So if you go into the YouTube channel, you will find a download for the Judy Blume text. And you can also download the slides that are going to be featured in this presentation for your classroom use. So all for free for the taking. Please subscribe to this new channel. So many of you know my old channel's defunct. I was adjuncting for a college and I'm no longer there. And so I don't have access to that channel anymore. So everything's moved over here and I'm trying to transfer some things from that old channel into this new channel. So please subscribe, hit the like button, and tell your friends and colleagues all about this new channel, Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. So speaking of Bob Ross, one of my adages that I'm always peddling around this ELA circuit is this. You gotta Bob Ross your instruction. So there's a fundamental difference between the assigning of writing and the direct explicit teaching of it. And here's what you're gonna see in this particular writing workshop. You're going to see me going to that blank canvas, going to that easel and painting, and I'm air quoting, painting exactly how to proceed through this essay from start to finish. I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project, and I also present for NCTE and Perfection Learning from time to time. And this is one of the things that I always encourage teachers to do. Get to the canvas and paint. Like, find some really good heuristics, equip your students with them, and that's when the magic really happens. So here we are. We got a blank canvas. We have to ask ourselves the question. So, how do I write the introductory paragraph? Well, here's the kicker. If I create a prompt in the fashion of the College Board, so FRQ2 on the AP Lang exam, if I do this right, implicit in my prompt would be two questions, right? So every single prompt for the AP Lang exam, FRQ2, has these two questions embedded in it implicitly, and it's kind of like a cheat, a hack, sort of figuring out exactly what they're asking us. So students need to perform rhetorical analysis from top to bottom, and oftentimes prompts that teachers create actually set their kids up to do plot synopsis, plot analysis. Kids are going to end up yielding a Cliff Note summation. So to really make sure that they're going to do rhetorical analysis, I always pose these two questions. What is the author's intent, and how does the author construct meaning? And in declarative model, which we're going to use, you always start with the question, how does the author construct meaning? And whenever you're asking that question, that's the thesis. So if we break this down kind of graphically, in the declarative model, I have a triangle is what it looks like. So you begin with the answering the question, how does the author construct meaning? And that's going to be 3 sentences long. So in order to avoid an essay where students get into their body paragraphs and they do 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, they have to see how the terms, the devices, the techniques interlock with each other. So in taking 3 sentences to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning, they begin to group together, link together the salient, like most germane terms, devices, techniques in the piece. And then they're going to have 1 sentence of what is the author's intent. So teachers pose that question other ways, like what's the universal truth? What's the universal theme? What's the exigence? I just say authorial intent. So to break this down into all of its bit parts, you begin with the thesis, right? The most salient, relevant, germane term to the piece. Then you got to sprinkle in some context and background and absolutely make sure that you're not plot summarizing, right? You don't want any plot summary in here at all analysis. There are other things that I do in my class, and again, I even do this with my on-level students. Tier 2 level vocabulary and sentence constructs. By Tier 2, I simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. I find among the expository modes, rhetorical analysis tends to be one of the geekier modes, so I kind of want my kids nerding out on this, but sounding natural, staying in their wheelhouse, staying within the range of their natural lexicon, but elevated vocabulary. Sentence constructs, again, if you're familiar with my YouTube channel, you know that I really hug on to Strunk and White and their book, Write It Right. And in it, they espouse that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So I'm really all about voice, rhythm, and flow. And I want my students not to write, successive independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences, which struggling and emerging writers tend to do, to avoid that da-dot type rhythm. So my students know the 12 sentence types, but they also know the 20 sentence patterns. So they're syntactical ninjas. They can make really good choices and know how to wield sentences pretty well. So again, in my YouTube channel, you can take a look at those Nuance Academy assignments. And then the kicker is that it's going to be 4 sentences long. Every single time my students write an introduction, it's going to be 4 sentences long, depending, whether or not they go declarative or the inverted route. So if we break this down, it's just a 3+1 paradigm. 3 sentences, construction of meaning, 1 sentence, authorial intent. So let's dissect the Judy Blume piece. Is Harry Potter evil? And I'll show you a few that I wrote as exemplars. So look at the beginning here. Again, I lead with the most important terms, devices, techniques. And in this case, I'm going to go with sarcasm, right? I think it's really, really important to identify that she's being sarcastic in this. It's an undercurrent of sarcasm. So my first sentence says this. Through subtle undercurrents of sarcasm, Blume chides recent cultural trends to find nefarious things in children's literature from far right-leaning conservative groups. So I got sarcasm as my most salient one. Her anecdotal bemusement questions the logic and rationale of such movements, rather tongue-in-cheek. So if we break that down, I think the anecdotal nature of the piece is really good. Questions the logic would be logos, so the logic and the rationale, and then tongue-in-cheek gets back to the sarcasm, right, the tone of the piece. Further, her syntactical maneuvers also accentuate a balance between her flip yet frank tone while drawing upon colloquial expressions to deliver her punchlines, right? So getting into a little bit of the diction, the syntax. And then here's the sentence of authorial intent. As an author who has been there and done it herself, Blume is asking an important question. When is enough enough? So she has a lot of rhetorical questions in this piece as well. So you can see 4 sentences, and it's 3 sentences construction of meaning. So you can see I either explicitly state the terms or imply them. I think a good teeter-totter balance of the two is really key. And then, things like, I don't like it when kids say logos. Her anecdotal bemusement questions the logos. I would prefer that my students to say the logic and rationale. And AP readers know that that's just, code for logos, and, they'll identify that. So I like a little teeter-totter balance between implicit and explicit. Vocab's up, you got good things in there like subtle, undercurrents, chides, nefarious, bemusement, accentuate, colloquial. So the vocab is up. You got a variety of sentence structures in here. Nothing's parallel, nothing's redundant. So out of the gate, this one's on fire. And I think, let's talk AP still, the elusive sophistication point. Out of the gate, I think an AP reader would say, yeah, this kid's doing all right. So if they can sustain this in the rest of the essay, definitely going to give this kid some sophistication point. So let's do it again, because that could be very confusing. And just to really shore it up and demystify it, let's take a look at a few of these. So here's another one. Again, it's going to follow the 3+1 declarative paradigm. Fostering a love for reading is a paramount goal in the education of a child. So Blume is ultimately questioning the logic behind the efforts by some right-wing groups to hinder this process. So begin with logos. Given that she's an acclaimed author who's been targeted by such movements, she anecdotally finds the holes in those espousing the belief that books such as Harry Potter should be banned. So kind of going with the anecdote again, I think that's really important. And then the logos is really, really, really important. So it's gonna emphasize that. So given that she's an acclaimed author who's been targeted by such movements, she anecdotally finds the holes in those espousing the belief that books such as Harry Potter should be banned. Almost diplomatically, so that's the tone, Blume holds back on her sarcasm. But in doing so, the point is clear. She's annoyed by these petty grievances and just wants kids to fall in love with the act of reading good books without the trifling of overconcerned parent and religious groups. It's the exact same thing. Last sentence, authorial intent. 3 sentences, construction of meaning, so that the thesis is atop. The sentence constructs are all varied. So I love it when my students can use commas and colons and semicolons and dashes correctly. And that all comes in my Nuance Academy. So they become quite masters of that. And then the vocab is nice. Fostering, paramount, etc. Anecdotally, diplomatically, grievances, trifling, overconcerned. So not overdoing it. I stay in my wheelhouse. I stay in my lane. I don't sound contrived. I don't sound like I'm forcing the issue. It's all in the wheelhouse. And again, another one out of the gate, solid foundation. So we're cooking with peanut oil on these. So students might be looking at this, even teachers saying, this is hard, Kristian. What are you talking about? This is impossible. With repetition and a lot of teacher modeling, this is very doable. So yes, you can. Let's look at exemplar number 3. 3+1. Tier 2 sentence constructs. Questioning the logic of the book banning crowd. So immediately logos again. Blume playfully deconstructs the argument and looks at it from the lens of an experienced and accomplished author. Largely anecdotal, she delineates why these measures to censor such books as Harry Potter are not only overreactive, but just plain naive and counterintuitive. Even her syntax belies the fact that she's fed up and is not going to hold back any critical punches. One of our nation's primary goals is to create a literate citizenry, and Blume is drawing into question how this can happen if we allow these outside groups to call the shots in terms of defining what is acceptable and what is not. So let's break all these down together and see the common thread. So typically when I do these, I focus on the 3 most salient terms, devices, techniques. Sometimes I'll go a 4th if the piece is really rife and juicy and there's a lot in it, but typically it's 3. My last sentence tends to hit the authorial intent, the exigence, the theme, the universal truth. First 3 sentences focus on thesis, right? The terms, the devices, technique that construct the meaning of the piece. My vocab is always up, and I focus on those sentence constructs to make sure that I'm wielding a good voice rhythm and flow. So if you're writing along with me, good place to pause. Teacher might want to model this a few times in addition, and students, share your work with each other. Have someone look over your shoulder. I'm a firm believer that the more eyes you have on your paper and the more writing you see, the better you become. Here's the thing, intros are done. We still got a whole bunch of canvas left. So we got to ask ourselves the question, so how do I write the body paragraphs? And we are going syllogistic method as always. So again, those that are familiar with my work, you know this never changes, even across the expository modes, even when we get into literary analysis and synthesis and argument and research, it never changes. So the syllogism, real briefly, comes from Aristotle, the Aristotelian tradition. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the aristocratic boys would go there, the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they'd often throw out these juicy, essential questions such as, what is justice? Which is the essential question of Plato's Republic, one of the seminal texts. And Aristotle noted that students that are really good orators are very calculative. They're very, methodical, mathematical in their reasoning. And one day he had a eureka moment and he said, I got a heuristic to teach my students how to orate, how to really argue and sustain clear lines of reasoning. And he said, it's the syllogistic method. And all it is when students go from premise to conclusion. So here's an example. Premise 1, arsenic is deadly, right? If I were to say that to all of you, you would nod your heads and say, yep, you're on the money, Kristian. But then if I say, my dog ate arsenic, you're naturally going to conclude, that's not going to bode well for your dog, Kristian. Your dog's going to die. Aristotle called that cogency. In composition, we tend, especially in AP circles, we tend to call it line of reasoning. And it's just a way to ensure that students capture their good thinking cogently on paper. So how do we morph Aristotle's heuristic into a heuristic for the purposes of performing rhetorical analysis? It looks like this. First premise, we're going to brand an argument containing terms, devices, techniques. And that move is going to take 3 sentences. And I'll model that for you a couple of times just to really shore it up and solidify it. So the first premise is going to be 3 sentences. On FRQ1 on the Lang exam, the College Board says your argument must be central. And I wish they would say that for all 6 FRQs, Lang and Lit, because we're engaged in expository writing, and expository writing is always an act of argumentation. So when we're arguing, I like to take 3 sentences. Otherwise, students begin to plot summarize, or they begin to quote and paraphrase up in sentence 1, 2. And often 3. And when they do so, they break the demands of the assignment. They're no longer engaged in rhetorical analysis. They're into writing cliff note summations. So I like 3 sentences to really set up the argument and make it manifestly clear to the reader the direction that the essay is going. Second premise, textual support. We're going to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. We really don't want to have one that's so much more than the other. And then body paragraphs need conclusions too. And the conclusion of the syllogistic method body paragraph is going to be where the textual analysis is housed. And these are just links, echoes, promises back to the prompt in the first premise. So a syllogism ultimately goes full circle. And all of this is going to take 10 to 12 sentences. So here's a little caveat. My students on the exam, on the AP exam, and even on the New York State Regents exam, they write 4 paragraphs because they have the 4-sentence intro, and then each body paragraph is going to be 10 to 12 sentences. When you're writing paragraphs that large and that analytical and critical, you can eliminate the third body paragraph, and then you just throw a conclusion on it at the end. So my students for 22 years have been doing 4 paragraphs for Lit and Lang, and our scores are really, really good. I know some teachers, when I say 4 paragraphs, they're like, oh my goodness, your scores must be hellacious. Actually, it's not. So they can analyze the totality of a piece in 4 paragraphs. So let's jump and take a look at what a first premise looks like. I'm typically not a big fan of templates because I find that they're too paint by number in terms of giving kids too many front-loaded like expressions and lines, and like they're not really thinking. We're just giving them sentence frames, and I just find that to be a little forced and hampering for kids. So in a heuristic, though, we often will give them just a little bit of a sentence stem if they need it. And for rhetorical analysis, my sentence stem is this. It's just a clause, right from the onset, comma. And students often ask, where do I begin? And I say, start where Blume begins. Go methodically through the whole thing, cross-weave when necessary, but have a chronology through your analysis. So in saying right from the onset, you're cueing your reader into knowing that you're going to have a good organizational structure in the piece. And then you just cherry pick the rhetorical terms, devices, techniques that Blume lays down, top to bottom. So in saying right from the onset, you begin right where Blume begins. So right from the onset, Blume assumes an almost maternal quality as she delves into the narrative of what she presumes was an innocent and pure intention to procure. So we're going to start with ethos, a children's book for her grandson. Personal and informal, her initial moves set the stage for her punchlines to be delivered. Her subtle sarcasm is wielded chiefly through her syntactical maneuvers, which enables Blume to dismantle the rationale behind the book banning craze. So we talked about this a little bit. I want my kids multitasking the terms, the devices, techniques. See how they begin to interrelate and interconnect and hold hands with each other. So in this, right, if the first premise is a promise, we're going to need quotes and or paraphrases for the ethos. We're going to need quotes and or paraphrases for the syntax, the sarcasm, and then by extension of that, automatically we're going to get into the logos. So you can see here, this is a packed agenda, but it's so much more ambitious and just more sophisticated than one paragraph tone, one paragraph, ethos, one paragraph pathos. It just doesn't work that way. So just to recap this, first premise, 3 sentences, focus on the rhetorical appeals, right? Focus on the devices, the techniques. So at this stage of the game, what I do is this in terms of writing. I put the first premise in the language of a promise, and then I go quote hunting. I need ethos quotes and or paraphrases. I need to, get all my evidence for syntax, all my evidence for sarcasm, and all my evidence for logos. And in doing so, I'm keeping the promise of the first premise. I'm going to ensure that my line of reasoning stays intact and that I'm cogent from top to bottom. So going from those 3 sentences to the second premise, it looks like this. So keep in mind, second premise always begins 4th sentence. And since I started with ethos in my first premise, it makes logical sense that I go quoting and paraphrasing her ethos, right? Align things, literally connect the lines, right? Like threads, line of reasoning. So I go immediately as if the stars become perfectly aligned. She informs us that she couldn't believe her good fortune at happening to be in London the very same day of the book's release. So one of the things my students will do, hopefully, is have sweet, silky, smooth quote transitions. So I do something called the 5-word rule. And if a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, keeps the quote relatively small, brackets as needed, the quote should sound conversational and be perfectly embedded. With the purest of hearts, she rushed to the bookstore in the hopes that this simple act would put her up there with the best grandmas in the world. Never assuming for a single second that her actions are impure, Blume sarcastically asked, "It's a good thing when children enjoy books, isn't it?" So you can see I got the ethos, going into the sarcasm. I still have syntax and logos to do. This rhetorical question is at the crux of the debate. Igniting the spark that enables kids to be lifelong learners is one of the core reasons why Blume dedicated her working life to writing children's literature. But to examine the logic, so now we're going to get into the logos, behind the push to ban such books, Blume must first flip the script. Simply put, the thinking works like this. If children are excited about a book, it must be suspect, right? So that's kind of the conclusion of the syllogism in the logos. Historically, this line of thinking has proven true in that Blume's books, it's reality that's seen as corrupting, while in Harry Potter, the perceived danger is fantasy. The dichotomy is clear. Evil can be found lurking everywhere these days, no matter the genre or intent. The use of such parentheticals heightens the sarcasm. Further, when Blume asks, "Gee, where does that leave the kids?" the answer is clear. The kids are fine, right? But we're not done. Like, you got to go full circle and cross the finish line and just tag a conclusion on this. And typically, usually my conclusions are like 2 sentences long. It keeps the promise of the first premise and really hammers home the thesis. So here's the conclusion, right? And again, this is all within one body paragraph, 10 to 12 sentences. Sometimes a book is just a book, nothing more, nothing less. But if one is hell-bent on finding what they are looking for, they are sure to find sinister things in the most innocent of intentions. So that's one syllogism, right? So if you want to pause here, have your students try their first syllogism. Again, teacher, you might want to model it a little bit. Crank out a couple first premises. That tends to be the hardest thing. Go quote hunting and then put it all together. But we're an intro and one body in. As I said, there's 4 paragraphs to write. So the question becomes, what do I do next? You bust out another syllogism. Oh my goodness. So you got to ask yourself, what's left? So based on where we are at in the passage of Blume's text, we're about the middle. So we got half of it left. So what we do is go gather our terms, devices, techniques, and we put them into the first premise. So here's an example of how I would proceed. Again, 3 sentences, drop the terms, the devices, techniques, interconnect them, jigsaw, link them, and you should be golden. To further her dissection of all the apparent flaws in the opposition's thinking, Blume weaves a number of colloquial expressions into her narrative to provide a bit of extra pep to her sarcasm. Citing examples spanning decades, she also enumerates the countless instances these witch hunts have occurred, including her own experience. So we're into enumeration, ethos, and yet again, as her argument advances, it's her syntactical manipulations that throw the real zingers into her assessment of the debate. So the syntax and the sarcasm are huge and unceasing throughout the the whole piece. So what I did with my students, because this was the first rhetorical analysis of the year, I gave them that first premise right there for the second body paragraph, and said, give it a whirl. Let's go quote hunting. And what do you have to keep the promise of? So we broke down the language of that first promise, and then on our whiteboard, we threw down the quotes and paraphrases that were absolutely necessary to keep the promise of the first premise. And then students gave it a whirl on their own and tried that second body paragraph just to experiment. So if this is the first time your students are going syllogistically, that might be a good idea. Show them my first premise, have them go quote hunting, have them write it, teacher model it, and just see how you do the first crack at it. So that's body paragraph number 2. We got to wrap the essay up. We got to throw a conclusion on it. So let me share with you a few of our favorite conclusion stems. Right? And again, I don't want my students painting by number, but some of them need some stems early in the academic year until they get their bearing. So just kind of thematic or wrap-ups, things like simply said, right? Simply said, Judy Blume, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day. And the one that we used for this essay, I just wanted them to give it a whirl, in a global sense. Bloom, and then they finished it, just to give it a try and see how it works. So I'm not a big fan of conclusion stems, but again, early in the academic year, some of my more struggling emerging writers feel the need for them, but ultimately they're training wheels, they're scaffolds, and I want them kicked off. I want the training wheels kicked off come exam time to write more authentic conclusions. So that's a wrap. Happy teaching, happy writing. If you need to reach out to me for anything, my email is teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I also, as I said earlier, am a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. We do some PDs throughout the year. On my webpage, which is www.teachinghowtowrite.com, there's a list of the PDs that are offered throughout the calendar year. Some are free, some are for a nominal fee, but you can see my comings and goings with them. Also doing quite a bit of presentation with in collaboration with NCTE. You can see my schedule of events with them. And I'm also doing a lot of tutoring with students. So I kind of opened the vault yet again on my old business endeavor of tutoring students. So if you are a student and want to work with me on anything from like your college personal statements, anything AP Lit, AP Lang, or just composition in general, give me an email and we can talk shop. So that's it. That's the end. Happy teaching and happy writing.